But first, something we need to face up to, a rot in our culture that's making us dangerously weak. Have a look at this guy, standing behind the Chinese dictator. He is Wang Huning, rarely seen and then usually somewhere back in the shadows somewhere. Wang Huning is one of only 7 members of the Standing Committee of China's Politburo, the top ruling body. But it's the one person there who hasn't run a province or a big department, is there because he's the thinker. He's a genius. He was one of China's youngest ever professors. And in his 30s, he got a scholarship to go work and study in America. And he wandered around the US and eventually wrote a book called America Against America. And if you want to understand why China thinks it could now win a war against America, this book will tell you. Now, Wang back then looked at America's drug problem, its race tensions, its gap between rich and poor, the weakening of even the family unit. And he said back then, this is going back 30 years, he saw a growing nihilism of Americans who are young, growing up very individualist and ignorant of traditional Western values. And he said, this is a crisis that will only get worse. America is falling apart. 30 years later, he's now on the Politburo, and it's actually hard to disagree because the same rot, well, you see it right here in Australia as well. I'll give you just 2 examples from just the past couple of days that Wang Huning would say, well, that suggests I'm right. 1, Melbourne University now wants to hire a gender affirmation officer, salary around $110,000 for a senior advisor that it says would be the first point of contact for members of the university community wishing to affirm their gender. Now, here you have a perfect example of the West's obsession now, with ourselves, with how we identify by gender or sexual inclination or race, and how we now even expect a university to spend taxpayers' money to promote our tender self-image. Second example, which is related, Claire Coleman is a poet and author who's won a prize meant to help Aboriginal writers, and she says, well, colonisers, by which she means non-Aborigines, colonisers often ask me why I don't identify with my Irish and English ancestry instead, why I prefer to identify with my Aboriginal family. And her answer to that is, if you could identify with the bully or the victim, with the murderers or the family of the murderers, with the genocidal colonisers or the colonised, who would you choose? In fact, you will now find many thousands of Australians identifying as Aboriginal in the census, people who didn't identify as Aboriginal in the census before. And Claire Coleman's answer suggests why. A disgust with their white identity or with Western civilization, and of course a love of victimhood. And what we're seeing here, we're actually seeing in all the main English-speaking countries now, like the US in particular. And you ask yourself what China would conclude from all this, identity politics and poor me and all that. Well, you don't need to think about it, you just need to look. You look at what China's actually doing while we're obsessing about our gender pronouns and our racial identity and what gender we really are and what victims we are too. China's dictator Xi Jinping has cracked down right now on anyone he thinks is too individualist. It's a new cultural revolution. It's got film stars and pop stars and tycoons, even like Jack Ma. I mean, it's super rich. Anyone who seems too full of themselves, they've been taken out of circulation, some wiped off the internet. Meanwhile, Xi is promoting pride in China. And he says his big aim is to finally reunite the country, to take back Taiwan, which is an island democracy with about Australia's population. Xi has even threatened war to take it over. And almost every single day, again yesterday, has sent warplanes to test Taiwan's air defences. The tension is so high, in fact, that when China moved weapons on the coast last week, the Chinese internet went nuts with rumours that war was actually about to start. And America's top general last week said, well, no, he didn't actually think war would happen for a few months yet, maybe even 2 years. But after that, who knew?
Based on my analysis of China, I don't think that it is likely in the next near future being defined as 6, 12, maybe 24 months, that kind of window. Having said that, though, the Chinese are clearly and unambiguously building the capability to provide those options to the national leadership if they so choose at some point in the future. But near future, probably not, but anything can happen.
Now, China actually looks like it really does mean business, but it could actually afford to wait a little longer because the US keeps getting weaker, relatively speaking, while China keeps getting stronger. Indeed, the Pentagon now thinks China will have 5 times more nuclear weapons 10 years from now than the US first thought it would. And China's also testing a hypersonic missile that flies at 5 times the speed of sound and hits a target at a mile a second. And this is huge because a conventional ballistic missile, well, that flies in a predictable arc, high enough for radar to detect it a long way away and maybe you scramble some air defences. But a hypersonic missile, that flies lower, much faster, and can weave around like an aircraft, making it incredibly hard to detect and even harder for Americans to stop. Now, China hasn't perfected this missile yet. Its last test missed its target by 30 kilometres. But it has built a target in the desert for more practice. The target happens to be in exactly the same shape as a US aircraft carrier. Now, all this is freaking Australia, of course. You've seen Morrison government, how it's hurriedly teamed up with the US and Britain to get more advanced weapons out here quick, not just the nuclear subs. Get them really fast, but it's all looking a little bit too late. And to be honest, I'm now wondering whether China has won already. Because seriously, is the US, are we, going to go to war to defend Taiwan? And you look how strong China now is. Are we prepared to risk, losing Darwin in a missile strike? Will the US risk losing Los Angeles? Would we dare to risk war when the US is now running war games which show it actually lose against China every single time? And China knows this. In fact, the head of its most aggressive newspaper, the state-controlled Global Times, arrogant man, also went to America, I believe, he's now bragging that just to ask if America could win proves it probably can't.
30 years ago, people might not have asked these questions, but things have changed. In reality, the possibility that the US military has the strength to defeat the People's Liberation Army in the Taiwan streets is becoming less and less. The US's willingness to devote massive amounts of people and resources in a fight to the death in the Taiwan streets is increasingly losing the support of confidence in an eventual victory.
But what does it matter if China invades Taiwan now or in 10 years? Ask Wang Huning, this great thinker who's got the ear of the dictator. Now, of course, it's not all hopeless. China is communist, and communist economies aren't usually as strong as they look from outside. And China's is in a bit of trouble. It could yet collapse. But in the West, our pride in what we have and our willingness to defend it, that seems to be collapsing already. And shouldn't we do something about that?